the mainstream take as first principles axioms, like self-evident truths, like everyone's a utility maximizer and things like that. And then they build very complex mathematical models. These models are supposed to predict what's going to happen in the world. And then if they're proved wrong, they would obviously be replaced by something else. Now, the only problem is, in reality, as we all know, that they were all categorically proved wrong in the financial crisis, but they actually didn't get booted out of the system. You don't boot one theory out and replace it with another unless you've got some others. Systematically, the mainstream has eliminated all opposition at source. So what we really need then is a type of economics that's useful. So you look at what happens, what type of mechanisms are at play, then you test it rigorously against real-world evidence, rather than just making something up and then ignoring evidence.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley, and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pina.
And we are delighted once again to be joined today by our friend, economist and author, Dr. Phil Armstrong. Thanks for joining us again today, Phil.
Great to be with you both, as always.
So as we record this, there's a video clip of American economist Larry Summers doing the rounds on social media, and it's an on-the-record interview. He's not being caught off guard. And he's on a tropical island telling the world that too many people in the US have jobs and that the Fed needs to step in and fix this horrible situation and create more unemployed people. And this isn't just what the US economists are recommending. It's global consensus among mainstream economists. Phil, could you talk about why orthodox thinkers like Larry Summers think that it's not just okay, but actually vital policy that millions of people should be deliberately kept against their will from earning a living? In other words, a roof over their heads, food on the table, heating, all that trivial stuff, not just at certain times, but at all times. There has to be, by design, some huge number of people prohibited from making a living. What's the rationalization?
Well, I think, as has been said before, it's like the buffer stock theory, I suppose, that the idea is that if you have a buffer stock of employed people or unemployed people, now obviously we like a buffer stock of employed people with our job guarantee, but they take the opposite view, a buffer stock of unemployed people. So the idea is that if inflationary pressure is like too high, that means that people are doing too well, everyone's quite rich and we can all spend money and have a nice life. So what we really need to do is engineer a situation where we have more people unemployed, which is obviously going to reduce the spending power of people. So they can actually spend a lot less, which will put downward pressure on the rises in prices. So in other words, when unemployment gets too low in inverted commas, that might seem a bit like an oxymoron. It's indicated by the price level going up. So it's like, oh, inflation's high. That means we must have too many people employed and doing well and spending too much. Therefore, we need to engineer a situation of more people unemployed, and that'll bring us back to the right type of level. What's quite interesting from a personal point of view, I went to this meeting in the city, and I may have mentioned it before. I think it was something like 2016, 2017. It was just before the Jeremy Corbyn election when he did pretty well. And at that point, some of the people in the city were worried that the Labour Party might, first of all, adopt MMT as a theory, whatever it was, and they're a bit nervous about it. And secondly, they might be worried that Labour might adopt MMT and bring it into, and how would it affect their interests? So consequently then, they invited me and a Labour MP that didn't turn up. And there was a lot of fear. And obviously I was able to allay their fears. Labour was never going to take MMT on board. That was a relief to them. The guy next to me said to me, well, it's very important that we maintain unemployment, which is like your question, in order to protect the value of his money, because he's rich. So I said to him, no, it's the other way around. I think we should have full employment. And if that does have some effect on the value of your money, that's the price I'm prepared to pay. I didn't get a clap for my speech, though, so you could probably understand why. But that's how I read it. It's an indicator that we're above where we should be. And they have a lot of complex theoretical things like natural rate of employment, or the thing that Patricia will be studying or will have studied, this idea of the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate, unemployment.
Well, it's predicated on it's very much attached to the view of long-term equilibrium, isn't it?
Yes.
Because what they believe is that in the long term, the economy is always tending towards full employment.
Yes.
So all they're doing is creating momentarily some unemployment to counter the ups and downs of the economy.
But it never comes to pass, does it? Full employment never comes to pass in that view. And it's, I believe, John Harvey channeling Keynes was saying that this is how we let ourselves off the hook. When it's not work, we just go, yeah, but in the long run.
Yeah.
And then to which Keynes says, yeah, in the long run, we're all dead.
They add so many lags to everything that it makes it impossible to really assess their theory in any realistic way, because, of course, everything that doesn't coincide can be explained with a lag.
And the point is, this long-run view, in the long run, we're tending towards equilibrium. That doesn't help people who can't afford to eat or heat their houses right now. And so, Patricia, what's our response to that as MMTers?
Well, just to start from the beginning, I guess, because at the moment we work under the assumption that monetary policy, the way it works is it adjusts demand. And then, as you say, that results in unemployment or more employment. And that way we stabilize the economy. But in reality, and even this is by the mainstreamers' own admission, there is the relationship between monetary policy and demand in itself, ignoring the supply side, ignoring the fact that monetary policy can't do anything about oil shortages or energy shortages, just focusing on the demand side, you're looking at really tenuous connections. The transmission mechanism of monetary policy is very complex. And when you look at the many channels by which the interest rate can affect demand, you come across quite a few. I think there are about 6 that I've seen, but also people keep bringing up more ways in which the interest rate can affect demand. And the overall result is entirely uncertain, because so far, nobody has shown whether any one of these channels is the dominant one or against the other. And they do tend to cancel each other out a lot. So the reality is we have no really credible tool for handling inflation. And the continued belief that monetary policy is the way to handle inflation is based on little more than just religious fervor. I don't know, what would you call that, Phil?
They're always difficult, aren't they, to analyse the mind of certain individuals. But my guess in all these things is that there's a lot of residual monetarism, this idea that if prices go, something's happened somewhere where the money supply, or there's more money about, and it's caused that to happen. And a lot of the time, whenever anything happens that right-wingers don't like, they will say, well, it's the government's fault, and the government at some point has created more money. So it's like when we had the COVID furlough, a lot of people called that quote-unquote printing money, and it would be inflationary. Now, there was no inflation. But what these guys do is, they're like the Cassandra. Every day they come out and look if the government's spending. The government's always spending too much money. and the government spending too much money, creating too much money, for these right-wing guys, is the source of all evil. So then, what happens is, government spends too much money, and at some, as you mentioned, out some lag, it will cause inflation. But because the lag isn't clear, you can make ridiculous things, and you get that now, which is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard, is the idea that Rishi Sunak, apparently, what he did was, he did the furlough to save the system, which in their terms is printing too much money. And now, 2 years later, we've got inflation. And it's nothing to do with the pandemic or the war or some shortages of raw materials or anything like that. It's all about creating too much money. And all of these guys, they all start to say, well, this is the cause of inflation. Now, if they think that the cause of inflation is always too much money, the only way they can really suggest some sort of solution is twofold, I suppose. Shrink the state. So you've got to have less government spending, and that's your bottom line. And in terms of the central bank, the central bank needs to raise interest rates because they all think that bank loans are sensitive to interest rate hikes. And that is the dominant mechanism. As you correctly said, there's loads of offsets, which we've mentioned before. So that's how they end up with that solution. So you'll notice that they're one-trick ponies. The right-wingers, you've got inflation. One, it's always the government or the central bank's fault. Two, the government spent too much money and or central banks have carelessly set the interest rate too low. And they'll just say the same old story, even though world events, it's obvious, isn't it, that world events have caused inflation. Everybody knows about the food price hikes and the gas and oil prices that seem to have abated now that started this inflation in the first place. So you can't seem to disprove them, and they won't come out from under their rocks to talk to us. It'd be nice to get one of these guys on the show so that we could all, have a pop, but they won't come out, that they're all hiding.
Believe me, we have tried. But so as we've been talking about, in terms of economic management, the only game in town around the world for a long time now has been monetarism, which for anybody new here is a central bank raising or lowering interest rates. This is often framed as the central bank controlling or at least influencing what gets called the money supply. And the idea is that if it becomes more expensive to borrow, there'll be less borrowing, because when private sector individuals borrow, new credit, new deposits in commercial bank accounts are created. So if you think that money growth in and of itself causes inflation, then raising interest rates slows down borrowing, which reduces the money supply and lowers inflation. Now, Patricia, I know you've been reviewing literature on the effects of interest rate rises, and that picture I just painted isn't quite how it plays out in the real world. Am I right?
I think now economists, and maybe Phil can correct me if I'm wrong, but they wouldn't admit that this is about controlling the money supply. I think they would say it's about controlling demand, and they accept, maybe not so openly, but implicitly perhaps accept that money is created through credit. But the issue is that they ignore a lot of channels for transmission. And I think Warren is really good at highlighting two of them that I haven't seen anywhere else, which is that interest rates are in itself could be considered fiscal policy because it increases the interest rate income of the private sector. And that in itself can create a hell of a lot of demand. So
yeah, I'll just jump in there and say that the thinking behind that is that the government is a net payer of interest to the economy.
Yes.
So when interest rates go up, the amount of interest income paid from the government to the non-government goes up. And so that creates demand. The other thing that Warren highlights, and I've also heard Robert Hockett mention, which we had him on the show a while back, is that the interest rate also serves as a means of pricing things like futures and other things that are intrinsic in the production process that are ubiquitous in the production process. So they are part of the pricing of many things. And therefore, by increasing interest rates, you are increasing the cost of production of many things. The other thing that I find that is quite interesting is that the New Keynesians, as we just discussed before, they believe that
adjusting the interest rate makes no difference to long-term growth, right? That they're adjusting just inflation, stabilizing the economy, and growth is given by your economy itself, but in the long term, that is. But the thing that I've read more and more about is what is the impact of the interest rate on actual investment? And it appears that even though the overall effect on borrowing is uncertain, and you may have even more consumption related borrowing or more borrowing against other things, there is I think a good argument in saying that raising interest rates increases the cost of long-term large machinery investment, because obviously you pay it over a number of years, and the longer you hold these debt for, the larger the impact of the interest rate, and therefore you are less likely to make those investments now than when the interest rate is lower and things like that. So if that is true, it means that raising the interest rate may have long-term implications on the productive capacity of the economy, which means that, again, the New Keynesian view of the economy being neutral to changes in the interest rate in the long run doesn't hold. So we could actually be undermining the long-term capacity of the economy, the long-term ability of the economy to produce, and therefore long-term prospects of inflation, by sustaining these really high interest rates for a really long time. Now, of course, there's the other band that talks about asset pricing when it comes to interest rates, and that's something else to look at. And assets in itself increase the wealth of certain groups of people, and that may in itself be a reason for investment or more consumption. So there are some economists out there who think that you could have the combination of increased consumption and yet long-term undermining of productive capacity, which could only lead to more inflation. So you see, they have all these considerations, and in the end, you have something that just simply doesn't work.
I agree. I remember Randy Ray making a very straightforward comment when he said, well, most people would agree that if you put the cost of a raw material up, like oil, it pushes up prices. Most people agree if wages go up, cost of production is going to put up prices.
Yeah.
So interest is a major cost. So obviously, to put the interest rate up, you don't have to think too hard that it's going to make prices go up. And I think the thing that you mentioned, Patricia, there, this idea of the long and short run money neutrality thing, the idea that what they try to do is they like to have the cake and eat it to new Keynesians, because the only thing that the Bank of England's got, who are trying to adjust demand or monetary demand or whatever they want to call it, is the interest rate. But they don't want to lose that idea of some sort of long-term money neutrality. So they make this artificial distinction of saying, well, okay, you can move the interest rate up, and in the short run, it might affect output and income and prices. But in the long run, all these underlying fundamentals, which they're never really clear what that is, determine your actual growth rate, how much stuff you've got, and the quantity of money still seems to determine the price level. So there's almost like this bizarre contradiction between the short and the long run, which doesn't really make any sense. And I think they're just trying to have the cake and eat it. You know, they don't want to scrap their old theories completely. But then again, if they accepted monetarism, they would have to control the level of money in the economy directly by basically stopping banks having the right amount of reserves, which means the whole payment system would crash. So they don't do that. It's obvious that the central bank can't control the quantity, and it wouldn't want to anyway because it would destroy the system. So it's like smoke and mirrors.
And banks know this, right? Commercial banks know that the central bank has to give them reserves or else the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, the central bank controls the price, yeah.
So it doesn't deter them.
Yeah, it controls the price. And as you say, there's so many, I mean, one guy was saying, I can't remember where I read it, and it's quite interesting. You know, you were saying that if interest rates go up, it might deter investment, increase the productive capacity. And I think that's true, because if you're a business, if interest rate goes up, your immediate costs of loans go up, which is bad. And also the cost of borrowing to finance future investment gone up, and then some projects might not seem viable. So it's pretty likely to have a negative impact on investment. But a lot of individuals, say, for example, we've all got credit cards now. It's not like loanable funds in the 1920s when there was hardly any consumer credit. Nearly everybody's got a credit card, unless they don't want to use it. So if your mortgage rate goes up, you have to pay more mortgages, and you might think, well, I won't take a bank loan now to get that new conservatory. But you still have to eat, don't you, and put fuel in your car. So you'd probably just run up more credit card debt. So, I mean, I haven't looked at the data, but it seemed to me what you'd end up doing is reducing sort of productive investment in future capacity, which is bad. But also doing something else bad, which is affecting individuals' ability to survive, like you said, Christian. So it doesn't work, and it's a disastrous consequence on the economy. And there's this phrase, path dependency. The new Keynesians just say, well, you can do something now, then you just go back to have a shock, and then you go back to equilibrium. But as Patricia was saying, if we reduce investment now, it's going to reduce our so-called growth path. And a lot of the investments that might be being put off might be green investments. They might not be environmentally damaging. They might be environmentally enhancing projects that we just scuppered, or the Bank of England has. So I see absolutely no benefit whatsoever in raising interest rates. What it does badly, and probably in reverse.
So I'm just going to throw this out there, and it's maybe more of a comment than a question, but could credit be said to be a Giffen good? Now, for anybody unfamiliar, a Giffen good is a product that people buy more of if it goes up in price, which kind of violates a perhaps oversimplified view of supply and demand that lots of people cling to. So an example would be if the price of bread goes up, it's a staple food, so people still buy it. They can't substitute away from it with something cheaper because there isn't anything cheaper. And because they're still buying this now more expensive thing and their income hasn't gone up, they've got less money to spend on other food. So they cut back on other food and double down on bread because it's still the cheapest food they can buy. So a rise in the price of bread means more bread gets consumed. Now, if you apply that idea to money, it's something you can't substitute away from, and MMT explains why. So it's something you've got to use. It's in a class of its own. There's nothing like it. So if interest rates rise and the economy runs on credit, so now you need more credit for production, more of it for consumption. So a rise in the price of money leads to more demand for money. And that seems to me to meet the description of a Giffen good. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah, to some extent. I come to the belief that, and maybe this will change, but I think that to some extent the government can't stop the creation of money. It can simply change the composition of that money. So if you think about austerity as taking away incomes from net financial assets out of the private sector, then that gets replaced through credit. And we know that causes instability, that causes inequality, that causes all these adverse effects. So if you lower people's incomes, even if monetary policy was successful at creating unemployment in the way that the government think it does, if people's incomes do lower because they've lost their jobs, then they still have to survive and find ways of getting into debt or racking up credit in order to maintain spending.
Oh yeah, sell a kidney, whatever.
Yes, but very often it pushes the private sector into more and more debt if you lower its income. So in a sense, you can't control the quantity of money in the economy.
We get that, but we're saying they're trying to influence it. And the theory goes, make the price of money more expensive, there'll be less money around. Whereas what's happening is what Warren's talked about a lot of the time, and it's what you've tweeted about this week, Patricia, which is actually people are creating more money via going into debt to pay for consumer items. It's not all about house prices. People are actually using lines of credit to fuel consumption. So the money supply, I know, for instance, Dirk Entz doesn't like the term money supply. There is no such thing. I think the way he puts it is the demand for money is always met, basically.
But demand for money increases because prices are higher.
Yeah. And so, the price of money goes up. the demand for money goes up, and therefore the actual amount of bank deposits goes up.
So if the cost of money goes up, and money being an intrinsic part of the production process, remember that the vast majority of money in the economy, if there is a money supply, is credit, then prices would go up as a result of interest rates rising, and that in itself would raise the demand for money. So yes, it is a vicious circle, I guess, like you're saying.
I've been trying to work out in all that time I've been listening, this Giffen thing. I think there's a little bit of traction in that analogy, but my feeling is, I could be wrong, because I've not thought of it till now, but it's a bit more possibly like the old idea of the pawn shop, PAWN pawn shop.
I thought you meant something else there for a moment.
There's a bit of traction there.
You know, when people got poor, they had to sell things, didn't they? Like their grandfather's pocket watch to get some money.
Yeah.
Now, in a way, when you're borrowing, you're selling an IOU on yourself, aren't you, to a bank? So I think what's happening is that potentially, and like, as the interest, if you're rich, you maybe think, well, okay, I was going to borrow a ton of cash for a new yacht or something, and now it's gone up a bit. I might postpone my borrowing for a new yacht. But for most ordinary families who might have mortgages, what's actually happening is they're having to spend more on their mortgage because it's, in a way, the price has gone up, which means they have to spend more. It's an enforced giving good, I suppose, as a caricature in a bit. So then they actually have to go and sell their loan note to survive. So what's happening is that's the equivalent of the pawn shop. Instead of selling their grandfather's pocket watch, they're now having to go to the bank or a credit card company and actually sell their own IOU to survive. So really, that's the kind of process. It's forcing people who are already in debt, i.e. ordinary people in mortgage, to get into more debt. So I don't really think, I think that mechanism, as again, I've got the econometrics and everything else, well, that sounds to me quite a plausible route, much more plausible than the idea that this assumption that the mainstreamers take, that when they have this, put interest rates up and it will stop borrowing, that really comes from the idea of this loanable funds idea. When there was very little consumer debt, they didn't really consider the size of government debt. So if you were saying we've purely got an economy of businesses borrowing money to finance new capital equipment, we had a zero government debt, no consumer debt, maybe, just maybe, it might possibly be the case that if you put interest rates up, it might be contractionary for the reasons we've talked about on investment. But to me, these other factors that are true now, like Warren said, we've got 100% debt to GDP ratio. So if you put the interest rate up, it's going to give a ton more cash to people who've already got cash. As we got said, it's going to force poorer people or people who've already got debts to go into more debt. That's capitalism. If you're in debt, you need to borrow to get out of debt, and it spirals out of control. So to me, at least just thinking about it and reflecting on it, it seems to me that higher interest rates, we would expect to actually be putting more income into the economy, and more than that, doing it highly regressively. So what we're really doing is we're handing out money to sort of people who own tons of government debt, and we're taking money away from, aren't we, the people who are already in debt. So it's highly regressive, a terrible policy.
So speaking about what you're saying about it being regressive, and this idea that Warren likes to point out about the interest income channel to the private sector, I took an interest in looking up at the composition of the UK debt, because I wanted to know, of the gilts that get issued, how many of these would be under a higher interest rate, and therefore who holds these and what amount of money are we talking about. And what I found is that the composition is usually 5, 10 or 15 years. So they're quite long-term gilts, I guess, compared to the US 3 months and things like that. But about a quarter of all the gilts that the UK government issues consist of indexed gilts, meaning that...
Indexed to inflation?
Yes.
Right.
Meaning that you don't even need to raise interest rates for the income channel to take effect as soon as inflation comes in. So obviously I don't agree with that. I think that we should get rid of those things, but it was covered in quite a lot in the Financial Times and the BBC about how interest debt repayments of the UK had jumped up exponentially because of those indexed gilts as soon as inflation jumped up.
Let's just emphasize as well that although we say new credit is created when private sector individuals and firms take out loans, no new what we call net financial assets are created for the private sector. Phil, would you mind talking about what we mean by net financial assets?
Well, it's like, say, you had a spreadsheet with the non-government sector, like currency issuers, banks and non-banks. So in a sense, if I gave you an IOU, I've gone in debt. And obviously, if you held it, Christian, you've now got holding my debt.
Right, you mean two currency users?
Between two currency users, yeah. Total balance is the same. So when a bank creates a loan, it creates an asset to itself, but also it creates a liability on itself, which is our credit. So credit and debit internally has to sum to zero. So the non-government sector, all the currency users, provided you've got a decent account and no one's fiddling on with a spreadsheet, technically inside money, that's money on the spreadsheet with nothing to do with the central bank and government, then that must sum to zero. This kind of came out, this inside money. I think Gurley and Shaw, as I remember from my own thesis a bit ago in the 1960s, they talk about this inside money, and it's since got developed a lot, and Randy Ray wrote about it in his 98 book quite a lot. And then, of course, if the government spends money, then say the government spent, I don't know, £1 billion and didn't tax any of it back, then that billion has to be with us in the private sector. So if you like, total saving in the non-government sector would be exactly equal to all the non-government borrowing plus what the government had just given us. So the only net financial assets of the non-government sector, they have all been created by, if you like, net government spending minus tax, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these people seem to think that the deficit is some sort of problem for the non-government sector, i.e. us in simple terms.
Yeah.
And this is just because they've framed it entirely wrong. Getting them out of that black hole, or that's going to be quite tough.
Just wanted to clarify two things. One is that what you just said there points me towards is saying that, so you can see that when the government spends, as we've said many times on the show and in our more introductory shows, the government is spending money into existence, and after the fact, it issues what we call government debt. And I often say government so-called debt because it's a choice. It doesn't need to offer the non-government sector but what is effectively a savings account at the central bank for people to put their money into and get interest income like we've just been talking about. It could just spend the money and you could mark it down as a debt. You could say, well, the government spent this much more than it taxed, but it doesn't have to be offset by the issuance of gilt. That's a choice.
Yeah.
There are other ways, if you think a positive interest rate is desirable, there are other ways for the government to do that. Not that we think a policy rate above zero is a good idea. We think a policy rate of zero is the natural rate, as Warren and Matt Forstater said. But also a few beats ago, Phil, you said, when we take out a loan or a private sector individual takes out a loan, the bank creates an asset to itself on its books. And I know what you mean, but it's more like we, or the person taking out of the loan, gives their promise to repay the loan in the future. And that is the bank's asset on their books. Your signed note to pay the bank in the future. Am I right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
We're swapping IOUs basically, but yes, it's on the bank's books. I mean, you could write it down and have it on your app, obviously, and you do. You've now got bank credit, which is what we use as money, basically, for our transactions. And that's their liability and our asset, and they've got our promise to pay, which is our liability. It's our promise to pay, and it's their asset. So turning the corner, we're talking now at the end of a week where Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and opposition leader Keir Starmer have set out what I'll perhaps overgenerously call their mission statements for the year ahead. And Rishi Sunak declared to reduce the national debt. as one of his 5 promises to the nation. Now, either of you guys could answer this. Through the MMT lens, why is this incompatible with 2 of Rishi's other promises, which namely are to grow the economy and to cut NHS waiting lists?
Well, I think at the end of the day, this whole idea of it's based on, I suppose, the usual mainstream idea that the government debt is like any other debt and it's sort of drag on the economy, so to speak. And instead, it's what we said, they've conceptualized the debt wrong. So what you'll do is you'll get these guys, they'll say, right, if you look at the national debt and divide it by the number of people in the population, that is actually how much, quote unquote, we owe. Whereas in fact, it's not what we owe, it's what is owed to us by the currency issuer. So they've got this basic idea that the national debt is somehow a burden on the ordinary people of the country. So it's a very easy platitude to say it's perceived as bad, so I'm going to say we're going to reduce it. Now, obviously, if they try reducing the national debt in of itself is extremely difficult, because what you're going to do is you might say, okay, then want to reduce the national debt, we'll try and reduce the deficit. So to reduce the deficit, we're going to spend less and or tax more. But the problem with that is that you've got to assume that, and this is the sort of expansionary, contractionary stuff that Osborne did, which we all know what happened to that. The idea is that everybody out there is like a free market type guy, and everybody out there is really worried about the government deficit. There's no evidence for that. They just think they are. So if the government says they're going to spend less and or tax more, reduce the deficit, which will knock a bit off the national debt, then everybody will feel so good about that policy. They'll all start investing more in the private sector. And because of that, the investment that the private sector makes means that government revenues actually grow tons, which fills the government imaginary coffers, therefore enabling them to spend more on the health service and end all the waiting lists and everything else. Now, it's such a convoluted chain. It's like, but the problem is many of the links in the chain are not connected. So he's got no chance and he's got absolutely no idea what he's doing.
I always find it really confusing that their theory requires everybody to believe the theory to work. And it's all very circular and my brain is a mush whenever I think about it too much.
One of the things that's quite, I'm not saying it's funny, but what happened with Osborne said he was going to reduce the deficit by austerity. Now, obviously, he couldn't do that because every time he tried to reduce the deficit by spending less and or taxing more, he caused a deep recession, which meant that the automatic stabilizers, as they were called, went the other way. So obviously, he smashed the economy, so tax revenues dropped. And then he had more people he had to pay welfare payments to. So that meant that the deficit actually got bigger, not smaller. So like a dog chasing its tail. Now, that's going to happen again to Rishi. If he tries to spend a bit less and or tax a bit more, probably the first one because he's a Tory, all that will happen is, ceteris paribus, he's going to shrink the economy and his deficit won't go down as he wants. And that's a good thing. Because as you know, we've just said with Christian, the deficit actually adds to the non-government sector's private actual net saving. So everything's the wrong way around. The deficit's good, not bad. He thinks it can reduce it by austerity type policies, although he probably won't use that word, it's a bit of a dirty word, but that doesn't work. So everything's so wrong that you can't really unravel it. It's like, and as you said, Patricia, it assumes that everybody in the world somehow is concerned with the size of the government deficit and national debt. It assumes that everyone's reading the Financial Times and everyone's a member of a right-wing think tank. They're not. I mean, we could have a little, maybe you pop to a pub or a supermarket, and then if people didn't think we were mad, we could go and interview them and say, what's your view on the need to reduce the government's deficit next year as a pressing priority? Or how big do you think the national debt is, and how big a priority do you think is reducing it? And most people would go like, what? Then they would say, however, I am annoyed because my mum was lying on a trolley for 3 hours in a hospital, and I think that guy, he needs to get his backside into gear and get some nurses trained and start paying people a decent amount of money so that they're not going on strike. I mean, these are what people are bothered with. They're not interested in the size of the national debt. I mean, 2% of the population, maybe, I'm guessing. People are not interested in the size of the government's deficit. It's a non-issue for people outside of economics. It's just not bothered.
They're being trained to accept this premise that it's their credit card debt. It's added on to their credit card debt. It's like, this is something that Clint Ballinger said on one of our episodes. And in order for there to be formal assets, there has to be formal liabilities. So for us to have a formal asset like money, somebody's got to make a promise, or in other words, a debt. And that's what the government debt is. It's our money. And another thing that is always worth emphasizing, you touched on it a minute ago, Phil, the automatic stabilizers. So that means that when unemployment rises, people get more benefit. The government's paying more out on benefits and it's getting less in income tax, which if you figure that through in your head, that means that the deficit's going to go up automatically. That's what we mean by automatic stabilizers. The idea is to give the economy a soft landing so that your unemployed person's income doesn't just automatically go to zero. It goes very low, but it doesn't go to zero.
And that's not about being nice. That's about the economy not collapsing.
Yeah, because we have to protect the economy. People not so much, but the economy, yes. So the idea is, as you were talking about with the Osborne years, the automatic stabilizers were increasing the deficit all the time. And then that goes to the other thing that Warren often says, which is, it's like a hairdresser going, God, no matter how much hair I cut off, it's still too short.
Yeah. I mean, the fancy term is the deficit, and the debt, which is just the accumulation, is endogenous. It's controlling the system. The government can't control the size of the national debt or the size of the deficit. It's no point even trying to control it. It's
a residual.
Yeah, it's a residual. Because if the economy's doing well, you tend to have lower deficit. And if the economy's doing badly, then you tend to have a higher deficit. But that's just what it is. You can't try to deal with it directly. It's putting the cart before the horse, or whatever phrase you want to do. It's the other way around. What the government needs to do, and all of your listeners will know that, is look at what we need to do. And that, as Keir said, everything we can do, we can afford. So we obviously need more nurses. We need a green economy. So the government needs to start spending money in those valued areas, diverting resources to those points. We may get inflation, but that's got nothing to do with that sort of government spending on moving resources from one point to another. It's obviously to do with things in the relative price structures. Warren says in his paper, things like oil and food. And everybody knows that. You know, this idea that current inflation is due to the government spending too much money. I mean, that is sheer fantasy. It's just right-wing propaganda with zero evidence for it. Now, obviously, if we ever did get to full employment, which we're not at, then, as everyone knows, we might have to start raising taxes selectively in the right areas as part of a plan to manage demand, given we have limited resources. But we're nowhere near that. And we just allow, in that way, the deficit goes where it's made. And I was thinking a little bit about analogies, and I'm not saying I've got the right one, but they talk about this money supply causing inflation sort of thing. Well, say, for example, I don't know, I wanted to drive to London in the car, and I get the car out of the garage, and I decide to drive to London. Well, I naturally consume, assuming I have an elastic supply of petrol, I consume petrol by going to London. True. So if you can observe petrol consumption, it's gone up. But the idea that the petrol consumption has caused my decision to drive to London.
Yes.
I mean, it's ridiculous. Now, you might say, well, we could stop people driving to London by not allowing them to have the petrol, for example. Yes. So if you go back to the military thing, there are various very important underlying reasons why we have got inflation. For example, currently, the pandemic and the supply chains, war and everything we've said, and that means that the price level's gone up. So fortunately, and it's a good thing, the banking system provides the necessary flexibility for the so-called elastic currency. So the money supply expands to allow us to cope with those prices, not the cause. And so if we did, not saying it's actually possible, well, just for imagine we could shut off the money supply, like the economists, inverted commas, say, the monetarists. Well, yeah, okay, we wouldn't let the money supply go up, and we wouldn't let people spend at the current prices. So I wouldn't be able to go to London, and the economy would, in the bigger analogy, just crash. And I think, personally, it's quite a good analogy how they've just missed the primary cause of something from a fuel or something that naturally expands to allow that to happen. So Dirk says the quantity of money, it's not that important. It's in the decisions. It's something that is fluid. It moves up and down in line with what's actually required to allow the economy to function. That's it.
But Phil, I'm pretty sure that if we were to plot a graph between your fuel consumption and the traveling that you do, we'd find a clear correlation, and therefore there is proof that the oil is causing your traveling.
Yes. And there you have it. There you've got monetarism in a nutshell.
In fact, you're playing the oil before you're traveling. That is further proof, right?
Yeah, you got it. You know what? Somebody once, I think it was in Doctor Who, opened up a Dalek and saw like a little squidgy thing, which was the actual Dalek. You've just done the same thing with a monetarist, haven't you? You've opened up the Dalekian head of a monetarist, looked inside of how they actually think. I think that's worth doing, that is. Yeah, absolutely. Spot on.
Tune in for more what we like to call the cart before the horse theory. Of driving. So, I mean, there was one thing I was thinking about the way promises could work, and that is, so he starves the economy of money, he cuts government spending, and the NHS waiting lists shrink because people just drop dead. That might be his plan, but obviously he hasn't been able to state that overtly. So now we turn to the good news, bad news joke, which is the good news is that our nominal opposition, the Labour Party, are ahead in the polls. But the bad news is that the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, is just as afraid of and or contemptuous of government's ability to do anything to help people's economic strife, vowing not to get out the big government checkbook. So nominally in opposition rather than materially in opposition. So Patricia, what can we say to that? How can we bring about a sea change in Labour?
We have to remember that, and this is a political comment, not so much an economics comment, but Keir Starmer does have a history of saying whatever people want to hear. So from the onset, I don't know how much weight really to assign to his words, how committed he is to all these ideals. It may be that he just wants to play the credibility game and commit to austerity now, but then once he's in government, that goes out the window. This was
a popular theory when Obama was running for office. The idea is that he's going to go rogue once he's in office.
I can dream, but I think that it's unrealistic. I think he probably has no idea what he's doing, and it's likely that he'll just stick to what is credible because he'll want to protect the Labour government once he's in power. And that's a recipe for disaster, in my view, because it gives the opposition a stick to beat Labour with from the onset. If Labour doesn't do as it's committed to, which is to balance the budget, then they will be opening themselves up for severe criticism, not just from the opposition, but from the media. And the narrative would remain intact that the government is like a household, and that in itself, the political environment will be very limiting for Labour to do anything meaningful.
What's a better way for us that kind of want an opposition that's going to win but doesn't have to? What's a better rhetorical way to talk about what needs to happen? Because obviously if they just stand there and go, well, look, we're not going to issue any debt and we're going to spend until everybody's got a job or something, you're just putting it that bluntly, which obviously we would not be scared of. If a leader said that, we wouldn't be scared of an opposition politician saying, vote for me, we're going to put money into the economy, that's our job. and we're going for full employment with price stability. This kind of stuff that we understand not to be scared of. What's a better rhetorical way to talk about what needs to happen to actually materially oppose the Conservative point?
What angered me about the speech the most, it was that he was leaning on the shaming of government spending, or leaning on the idea that government spending is by itself immoral and a bad thing, instead of defending the view that it's not immoral, it's not something bad to do, it's actually an essential part of our economy if we want to have a good economy. And it means that the prevailing narrative is the Tories. Even if Keir Starmer is in power, he won't really be in power, it'll be the Tory narrative that prevails. So I think it's fundamental that we challenge that view.
In a way, I'm just thinking that, okay, he doesn't have to do that shaming. There are plenty of options out there. They could stand there and say, look, our 3 watchwords at the moment are investment. It's been an investment drought and people are just gasping and on their knees right now.
But that's what Corbyn did. That's effectively what Corbyn did. And what Keir Starmer is trying to avoid is the same onslaught that Corbyn faced.
Yeah. I think what steered in, I agree with it, bad for your mental health, but there's almost 2 ways forward, isn't there, with something like Keir Starmer? First of all, I don't think he's going to do anything that I suggest, because he's just acting like a shadow for the Tories, like shadow boxing, or he's trying to not keep the distance between him and the Tory party as small as possible, but just be slightly nicer and slightly more efficient. He's not really going to do anything materially that different. I guess it's like if you said, I'm going to take a card out of the pack and you've got to tell me whether the next card's going to be higher or lower, and the card comes out of the pack as a queen. Well, it's much more sensible just to say a jack. You don't have to risk anything. So he's thinking the Tories are that bad. So if I just sit fairly close to them and just pretend I'm going to more or less be like them, but just better and more sensible at what they do, then he's got far less chance of being attacked. I mean, I don't agree with that tactic, but in a nutshell, I think that's what he's doing. But I think if you look at what Labour could do, let's assume that they don't understand MMT, they have no understanding of how the monetary system works. And I think that's a safe assumption. No leading politicians understands how the system works, and they haven't got the courage to talk about, even if they did at this point. So let's say Keir Starmer doesn't get MMT, but he decides he wants to break with the Tory narrative. How could he do that? Well, to me, it's quite simple. I mean, you would just say, right, look at the pandemic. We know who we really needed in the pandemic: the health workers, the ambulance drivers, train drivers, teachers. And he should just say, okay, what I'm going to do is ensure that all of these people are correctly and fully rewarded for the efforts that they did for the country. And that'll get a good round of applause in a Labour conference. And then he would say, now we're all aware of the fact that if we spend too much, we might get inflationary pressure. So that may require taxes to be raised at some point on the people we realise after the crisis were less productive, like the financial markets, for example. Now, he's not then really doing anything too drastic, but what he's doing there is letting everyone know who he's going to back, i.e. workers, and who will be, in inverted commas, paying the price to support. Now, in order to justify that, all he needs to do is put a load of data about inequality on the thing and say, this is what I'm doing it for. Now, that, obviously, it's a bit like Cobb. It's not basic on economics. It's just saying, right, fairness. Who did we need in the pandemic? These are the people we're going to reward. These are the people who we didn't need in the pandemic and we don't really need now. You could put it slightly more politely than that. I wouldn't, but he might. And that's how we're going to do it. Now that, you would have to say, well, okay, the reason he won't do that is because he's absolutely petrified of markets, foreign exchange markets, the city. And he runs in fear of markets. So they won't do that. And the other reason that the Labour Party won't do it is most of their MPs are careerists. So they think they want to win next time. And then once they're in, they want to stay in And they're not all. I mean, there's some great Labour people, great Labour MPs. The York MP, Rachel Maskell's really good. I like Diana, but we could list the people in Labour, whether we think they should stay in or not, or we respect. But a lot of them are careerists. They just want to get re-elected. So he's not going to do that. He's just going to play the Tory game, as Patricia said. And I don't even listen to what he says. I see enough of what snippets on Twitter, and I just have given up with Labour, I think, what will be. And it's sad, and it doesn't need to be that way, because the pandemic showed everybody. And the fact that nurses and that railmen have got quite a lot of public support shows that this would not be a big risk, I don't think, with the population, but it would be a big risk regards markets and the city. And I think New Labour's and the current Labour are more frightened of the city and markets than the Tories. It's almost got more to prove to them. And that, to me, from my interviewing Jonathan Reynolds, who was a very nice guy, I interviewed him down in Parliament about Labour, and he's a nice guy. But I can tell he's just thinking, we couldn't possibly do anything, like I said, because the value of the currency had tanked to zero and the city had closed down. You know the usual stuff.
You say this about them being careerists and them wanting to be in government, and I absolutely believe that about Keir Starmer. But he actually doesn't care too much about his impact once he's in government. He just wants to stay for as long as possible, even if he does nothing. And there are graphs, for example, we know that we are in the middle of an NHS crisis at the moment, and the Tories are refusing to do anything about it. And it is true that Blair's Labour provided more funds to the NHS than the current government does. It's absolutely true that funding for the NHS has decreased dramatically since the Tories came to power. So a lot of people will be tempted, and rightly so perhaps, to vote Labour on the basis of, we desperately need more funding for the NHS, which is true. But at the same time, Blair's Labour did, despite providing more funds to the NHS, they did other work which prepared the NHS for the situation that we have now. Inviting the private sector into the NHS is almost doing the Tories a favour for future dismantling. And I fear now, my biggest fear is that we're going to elect a Starmer probably, and a lot of people will be pleased with the fact that the NHS will be getting more funding, probably. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was actually Starmer's Labour who dealt the final blow to the NHS, saying, lending credibility to the idea that the NHS cannot survive. And I think to some extent that can only come from Labour. Labour would be the only party that people would believe the NHS is not savable.
It's Nixon going to China in reverse, basically.
I think you're absolutely right. And there is, and you'll know if you on social media, that there are these two groups. That there are people who, the so-called pragmatists. And the idea is that there's only two options on the table. There's a dreadful Tory party and a better Labour Party. You might disagree with how much better it is, but they are better. Therefore, given that's the choices, you have to vote Labour simply because we just got to get the Tories out.
But the problem is we have only two choices. That's the problem.
See, I don't follow that. I mean, as you might imagine, for all the reasons you say, that might possibly, just possibly bring you a short-term gain. But if you had Labour elected as a slightly lesser of two evils, we know, I've heard Wes Streeting. Now, if he's a Labour man, I'm a Dutchman. As far as I know, no heritage in the Netherlands whatsoever. All this, we need to bring in more. This is all those private-public partnerships. And as you say, if Labour come in and say, we don't like the Tories, but they were right, really. We do need more private sector stuff to make the health service work. So, to me, voting Labour is not something I would do as a general policy. I'm not saying I wouldn't like anything else. They're all different. I have respect for people who've got maybe a Labour MP that they think is a brilliant individual MP, or they might want to vote for Zara Sultana because they think that it's very important to get a left-wing voice still elected. There's all these nuances. But I don't accept this. You have to vote Labour just to get the Tories out. We have no opposition, for all the reasons that you said, Patricia, and the fact that the people who are saying that are often the rank hypocrites who slagged off Jeremy and did all they could right to the death to undermine Corbyn's Labour. And then, having done that, they tell the left that they are quote-unquote Tory enablers, and that's supposed to make us feel that we want to come and vote for them. And if you find the tweets these people were saying in 2018, Corbyn this, Corbyn that. So unless someone can actually prove to me that they've always supported Labour to the hilt, and then telling us I have to vote Starmer, then I might listen to them a bit, but that's very much the minority. I mean, I very much think that this is a dead end. New Labour 2 and Starmer, I don't see it going anywhere personally. If he wins, not much will change, certainly in the short term. I mean, I sound a bit gloomy. Forgive me. It's just, I've lost all sort of faith in Labour.
It's hard to feel positive about the current state of things, but to some extent that's empowering, because it means that we realize nobody's going to give us the option we want. We're going to have to build that from the bottom up ourselves. And I think the sooner we realize that, the better. And of course, we need to, well, there's an awful lot about the left, about coming together around a single cause and all that. That is difficult, but I think that's where we need to be, really.
So we need cultural political change. And looking ahead to the immediate future, Phil, the book that you and the Gower Initiative founders, Prue, Sarah and Claire, and MMT scholars from around the world, and the UK's very own Andrew Wilson, Neil Tye and Andrew Barclay, this book entitled Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights, Leading Thinkers is about to be published, which is very exciting. And your chapter, co-written with Jamie Morgan, is entitled Modern Monetary Theory as Post-Neoliberal Economics, the Role of Methodology Philosophy. Tell us about that chapter.
Well, basically, obviously what we try to do at GIMS, and I hope you'll get the chance to talk to the GIMS girls yourself on the podcast. And I mean, basically what we try to do there is obviously get the best authors we could. So obviously we wanted to get Neil and Andrew and Richard's magisterial work condensed into about 15,000 words. It's the longest chapter in the book. That's absolutely fabulous. We obviously got Warren Bill and Randy Ray, and we've got them in there, and that's brilliant. But very importantly, I'm very interested in the philosophy underpinning economics. So there are two great guys out there. One's called Tony Lawson, the other's Jamie Morgan. And I know Jamie quite well. He's been very supportive of my work, and he is a phenomenal mind. I mean, he's a super brain. And so I just basically wanted to recruit him. You know, we've used this Magnificent Seven analogy in the past on the podcast, but I thought, who knows most about the philosophy underpinning economics so that I can access? And Jamie Morgan fitted the bill. I got him to write the chapter with me. Most of the deep philosophical analysis comes from Jamie. I must say, I feel a massive debt of gratitude for him to agreeing to co-author with me. Fantastic scholar, very well read. And what we try to do in there is to say, okay, the rest of the book is really about individual MMT scholars highlighting key issues. But what we try to do is like set the scene in the sense of under-labouring, as it's called. Look at the type of philosophy that might underpin a better form of economics. So what we really do is, I mean, it's quite a longish chapter, but essentially what we look is we compare the, if you like, the method that underpins mainstream. The mainstream type of economics is, well, what's called deductivism. So what they do is they take as first principles axioms, you know, like self-evident truths, like everyone's a utility maximizer and things like that. And then they build very complex mathematical models. And these models are supposed to predict what's going to happen in the world. So the idea is that these very complex abstract models predict what's going to happen in the world as like some sort of machine. And then if they're proved wrong, they would obviously be replaced by something else. Now, that sounds plausible. The only problem is, in reality, as we all know, that they were all categorically proved wrong in the financial crisis, but they actually didn't get voted out of the system. So what's actually happened is they pretend they could be proved wrong, but in reality, they're not. And one of the reasons that happens is that you don't boot one theory out and replace it with another unless you've got some others to move to. And what's really happened is that systematically the mainstream has eliminated all opposition at source, or tried to. So all the major universities, all the major journals, they all have mainstream, and as you guys have talked about, this new consensus macro, which is predominantly new Keynesianism, that dominates all literature, so the others don't really get a hearing. So then what Jamie particularly highlights in the chapter is this idea of being a useful economist. And this comes from the work of Jamie Galbraith, who was one of the guys that recommended the Gibbs book, son of the famous J.K. Galbraith. And in his own right, Jamie Galbraith is a fabulous economist, a good friend of Warren's, etc. And he talks about this idea of useful economists. So the idea of mainstream is what they do is build abstract models that make predictions that are often wrong, but they don't have any use, practical value to the real world. So what we really need then is a type of economics that's useful. And the idea of that is, instead of like making up axioms, which may or may not have anything to do with the real world, what we do is we look at the world and we try to think about what might be the case in reality. What are the mechanisms that may exist to cause what we actually see? And this is not deduction, but a thing called retroduction. It's moving to the most plausible explanation of what we see. And this is an idea of basically seeing things and moving back from there, hence retro, to try and conceptualize and imagine the types of mechanisms that might be causing what we see. And it's based on this realist social ontology. A lot of it comes out, if your listeners have heard of Roy Bhaskar. And Roy Bhaskar talks about it as a real domain that we can't see directly, mechanisms and powers. This causes events. And these events are studied by social scientists in some sort of community. So the idea is, what we would do is we'd see what happens in the world. We'd have a flash of inspiration, maybe, as to what mechanisms might be causing that. And then we'd go about rigorous study to highlight these mechanisms and to see if we can actually identify what's happening and to refine them. And what we would argue is that with MMTers are doing just that. So say in the case of Warren, he's working in the city and he sees things happening in finance. He sees things happening. Even he doesn't know how he can see these things. We all know the famous phrase about Warren, isn't it? He sees things others don't see. He's looking at the same things where he sees them on a deeper level. And then we try and pick out the mechanisms and we look for what's happening in the world and trying to summarize it, which is quite difficult. The idea is, using one of Tony Lawson's phrases, who's a realist social ontologist, we look at things that stand out in the flux of experience, things that are a shock. And one that we highlight in the book is that everybody knows that the mainstream consider the government as a currency user, borrowing from a fixed pot of savings. And one of their very strong contentions was, very firmly stressed, is that when government deficits go up, the long-term interest rate tends to go up because governments are borrowing, and obviously the extra demand for that borrowing, like the old loanable funds, will drive up long-term interest rates. The problem with that is, when we looked at every single country in the world with its own currency, in the period at the end of the crisis, near the end and beyond, in all of these countries, year on year, the interest rate fell as government deficits went up. And what MMT can do is, of course, show that that's the case. You know, why that's the case? Because we obviously conceptualize governments as currency issuers. So effectively what was happening is governments are spending first, as we all know, and then they were selling debt later. And the government can set debt, government central banks can set interest rates at whatever level they're right. And the interest rate on debt was actually not determined by the size of the government deficit, which is what the mainstream has said, was actually determined by what the people buying the debt perceive future interest rate settings to be. And because at the time after the crisis, everybody thought interest rates would be very low, which they proved out to be, the interest rate on debt fell. And that's an example of how realist social ontology and reproduction works. So you look at what happens, you try and imagine in your head what type of mechanisms are at play, then you test it rigorously against real-world evidence, rather than just making something up, which is what the mainstreamers do, and then ignoring evidence. And obviously the chapter develops this at length. As I said, Jamie's phenomenally well read, so anyone's very interested in philosophy, economics, there's a lot of that in there, and it's there as a scene setter for the rest of the scholars.
Oh, there's so much to look forward to in this book, and that is a whole other episode, I'm sure. But our point is there are real solutions out there, and this book will be another stepping stone to get us where we need to be. And I think that's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking with Dr. Phil Armstrong, economist and co-editor of Modern Monetary Theory, Key Insights, Leading Thinkers. And we'll link to where you can order the book in the show notes for this episode. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Phil Armstrong.
Many thanks, Christian, Patricia. Always a great pleasure to be with you.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.